hold on. Now I'm going to really say hello and say thank you for coming to this Caste panel. This is a panel that's discussing the ideas that are in this book, which was published last year and made a big splash. If you just type Isabel Wilkerson into your podcast search app, you'll see her talking with all kinds of people, Oprah, Barack Obama, etc. But we had a Caste panel. We had part one of this panel last fall. And if you want to watch that after this, the recording is one that I just placed in the chat, where we talked about the idea of caste with Professor Banerjee, with Professor Stern, with Professor Sengupta, and with Professor Fleming. And now we're doing part two, where we're going to hear from Professor Meyer and Professor Ebert and Professor Carp and Professor Remy, because it's a very rich possibilities in this topic, and they can extend to lots of areas of the world and lots of times in history. So what we'll do is each professor will talk for less than 10 minutes, and then we're going to sort of open up the floor for conversation. If, as Professor Meyer is talking, you've got a great question and you want to pop it in the chat, go for it. If you want to pop it in the chat and save it for later, that's cool. If you want to send it just to me because you don't want to say it, but you want me to say it, that's cool. So really feel free to make this as participatory as you'd like. But we'll start with Professor Meyer, who's our historian of China and Asia, East Asia, and he's teaching next semester. He's teaching a course in mysticism, magic, and ritual in China, and a course called Religion 3005. I don't remember the history course number, but it's religions of China, India, and Japan. So sign up for those courses and listen to him talk now. Thanks for talking.
Also modern Japan.
Also modern Japan. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mancia, and thank you everyone for coming today. I see a lot of people I know in lots of different contexts. Thank you for coming. In thinking about what I would want to say today, I sort of envisioned that there were two possibilities. One was to take some of the ideas in Isabel Wilkerson's book and sort of apply them to the case of China, and see how they test out when we use some of her frameworks to look at Chinese history. And I'd be happy to do that, if people want to talk about that. But I decided to go another way, which was just to maybe give a little bit more personal response to the book. I encountered this book. I actually bought this book as a gift from my mother, which I say because I noticed she's on the Zoom call now. She was the first of us in our family to read it. And she was so moved by it that she convinced me I had to read it right away. So I've stolen back the copy that I gave to her as a gift, and I read it. And Caste is an interesting book, right? I mean, it's an enormous cultural phenomenon now. It sort of straddles this boundary between academia and sort of culture writ large. And I think it's possible and it's understandable for academics to maybe have a little bit of a defensive reaction to it, because Wilkerson's not an academic, she's a journalist, and she's kind of, she's come onto our turf, right? She's using all of these categories and social scientific and analytical concepts, which we claim as our preserve, which is okay. But I'm very impressed by this book. And so I want to give some sort of personal reflections from my own experience about why it's made such an impact on me. The argument that I think Wilkerson is making that's so compelling, and you can buy it or not, there's certainly room to criticize it, but she's saying, what she means by caste, she's talking about a particular complex of different ways of subordinating people within a society. She outlines what she calls the 8 pillars of caste. And any of these 8 pillars can be found in lots of different societies throughout the world. today, back in the past. But her argument, as I understand it, is that really, if we search human history for the moments in which all 8 of these forms of oppression were integrated in this particular way, there are really 3 instances. There's the experience of African Americans in the United States, really going back to colonial times. There's the experience of the Harijan or Dalit people in India. And there's the experience of the Jews in Europe during Nazi Germany, right, during the Nazi regime. But those 3 instances are unique instances in which we see this particular form of control and subordination and oppression happening. And like I say, you know, there's room to debate that, but it is a very thought-provoking assertion. And you know, the question is, well, how much explanatory power does it have? I think Wilkerson in her book, she's very transparent. You know, she was searching for explanations about what she was experiencing in our own politics here in the United States. And, you know, offered this argument, offered this set of analyses as an explanation for some of the really, really, I would argue, bizarre phenomena that we experienced in the last 4 years, right? So I wanted to give, you know, some reflections from my own personal experience that led me to believe that, yeah, this is a very thought-provoking and potentially illuminating argument that she's given us. So I first lived in China, and forgive me, if I go over time, you can just cut me off. But I first lived in China as an undergrad in 1987. It was really only about 7 or 8 years after the China had been opened to tourism and study from American students. I lived on a small campus in Beijing. All of the foreign students were isolated in a dormitory that had been set aside for us. We were being kept apart from the rest of Chinese society. And so, you know, my contact with Chinese students on the campus was limited, but I was able to make some friends. One of the friends that I made there was a student named Li Jing, who was kind of the curator of our dormitory. And he had been chosen for that task because he was a student in the English faculty at the college that we were at. And we became friends. And at one point he asked me to do him a favor. He had a textbook reading that he had to do some kind of oral project on. And he asked me to read it into a tape recorder for him. So I did. And I sat down. It took me about a half an hour, but from the beginning, the reading went like this. Black people in the United States cannot live as free individuals. They are, you know, routinely beaten, and, you know, and it went on like that for 30 minutes. And the fact is, you know, a lot of the information was very accurate. It was about ways in which African-American rights were curtailed legally, Jim Crow, statistics about African-American poverty. And, you know, I read the whole thing into the recorder. You know, I felt compelled to tell Li Jing, you know, this is a little bit biased. You know, there is another side to this story. But I realized in looking around and in reading some of the Chinese literature that the students who were not in the English faculty were reading, that this was a very standard image of America in the People's Republic of China, and remains a very standard image of America today. Every educated person in the People's Republic of China gets this information about the United States. So, you know, the story about racism here in the US is no secret. So that's anecdote 1. Anecdote 2, I was able to meet a student as a language exchange partner. Her name was Liao Yanping. We would meet occasionally in different parts of campus. I would speak Chinese to her, she would speak English to me, and we would help one another with our language study. I was able to get special permission for her to come into our dormitory one night so that we could have our meeting in our cafeteria. We needed special permission to have anyone from outside of the dormitory come in. she did one night, and we were sitting in the cafeteria. And while we were sitting there, one of the other American students named Alice, who was African-American, walked into the dormitory, into the cafeteria. Liao Yanping went white. I had never seen someone look so spontaneously terrified. And, you know, I said, "What's wrong?" And she said in Chinese, "There's a Black person in here." And I said, "Yeah, that's Alice. You know, she's one of the other American students." And she said, "But I'm very frightened." I said, "Why? Have you ever met a Black person?" She said, "No, but I've seen many American movies, and I know that they're all very dangerous." So, you know, Liao Yanping was she was a college graduate, right? She was doing a master's in the area. She had had all of the information that I had read into the tape recorder for Li Jing. She knew the whole story about racism in the United States. But for the last 7 or 8 years, that she had been able to see American Hollywood movies, the few that were allowed to be shown in China, and they had taught her, right, that Black people were very, very dangerous. So to me, and the thing is, of course, remember, these are movies made in the 1980s. So these are not movies that are telling people that, you know, explicitly Black people are dangerous. They're movies like Lethal Weapon, right? And, you know, think of any of the popular movies you went out and saw in the 80s, those of you who are old enough to remember the 80s. You know, and to me, this is an example of some of the powerful explanatory sort of force that Isabel Wilkerson's analysis has. That these elements of caste, the things that she's talking about in the book, are so integrally woven into the they're so subtly incorporated into our culture and into all of the different kinds of messages and institutions that we live with, that we're not even aware of the ways in which we are representing our society to the rest of the world. You know, again, I can talk about, you know, if we look at Chinese history, if we look at Chinese society, do we see examples of this kind of subordination? Are there groups in Chinese society that are equivalently not just marginalized, but kind of demonized this way? I would argue no, with perhaps one exception, the exception being what's going on right now with the Uyghurs. It obviously approaches this, but in much of the rest of Chinese history, I'd say no, which doesn't mean that Chinese society is necessarily a more just or humane or peaceful place than the United States. They have their own problems, just problems of a different kind. But I think Isabel Wilkerson is on to something, that there's something pretty particular going on here in the United States. So I don't want to go over time. I hope I kept my remarks.
Thank you, Professor Meyer. That was actually a really lovely way of also introducing, you know, for those who don't know what's going on in the book. Yes, silent Zoom applause for Professor Meyer. So we're gonna turn to Professor Ebert now. Professor Ebert is teaching a colloquium on economic history next fall. He's also teaching Shaping of the Modern World.
Summer.
Oh, in the summer? Sorry.
Oh, no,
Go ahead, you tell
us. The colloquium, you're correct. I'm sorry, yes. Dutch Republic, yeah.
Got it. So all his stats on the fall are there in the chat, but what are you teaching this summer, Professor Ebert?
That's a MA course in comparative industrialization. Okay.
Cool.
Professor Mancy, is it too late for me to use a PowerPoint? I just rather share my screen. Okay, good.
We're co-hosted.
Okay, there we go. So I, again, will try to distill a pretty complex analysis into 10 minutes, and we can unpack it further if we like. And looking at the Americas more generally provides the counterpoint to Wilkerson's analysis, as you know, various people have pointed out. In some ways it can maybe confirm some of her analysis, and other ways it can sort of challenge it. So I'll I'll just bring up some examples related to race, religion, and honor in very general terms that might do that work for us. Let me just do. Oh, you know what? I'm not going to do the full screen because you can see it. So let me start with a quote from a primary source that comes from, I think I will. Hold on. Comes from a travel document, a travel narrative that's from the early 19th century. This is a time when Brazil was still a colony, and it is a British man who was traveling in Brazil, and this was he spent a lot of time looking at the various groups of people that existed and relations between them. And this is a comment he made. I think this is pretty well known. In Brazil, even the trifling regulations which exist against them, he's referring to mixed race people, remain unattended to. Mulatto, would be the term used at the time for somebody who was half of European and half of African extraction, enters into holy orders or is appointed a magistrate, his papers stating him to be a white man, but his appearance plainly denoting the contrary. In conversing on one occasion with a man of color who was in my service, I asked him if a certain Capitão Mor, what a head of a local militia, was not a mulatto man. He answered, he was, but is not now. I begged him to explain when he added, can a Capitão Mor be a mulatto man? So I think you can see where this is going. This is that we need to account in colonial Latin America, that is the countries that had similar histories and trajectories as the United States and experience with the bringing enslaved Africans, had very different outcomes after independence. And in the case of the Spanish and the Brazilian colonial world, we see in the case of Brazil, the continuance of very widespread slavery, but also the existence of a very large group of freed people of color, and as well, and mixed race people. And in the case of the Spanish colonial world, we see the disappearance of slavery and then a very large population of mixed race people, both of African and European and Indian inheritance and mixtures thereof. All right, so I'm going to just move very quickly to a couple of images. Whoops. Just quickly, you just hold this in your mind. Juan Correa painted at the end of the 17th century, La Pascua de Maria, a very skilled European painting, probably would call this a late Baroque style. This was a commission from a wealthy churches in Mexico, which was at that time known as New Spain, a center of one of the Spanish colonial areas, were very rich and could afford to pay people, and anybody who got such a commission would be of very high social status as well. And then some other paintings which you may have encountered, the so-called Caste paintings, and this brings us even to the word. The word has an Iberian origin, as it turns out, and the Iberians were very interested in identifying people by these kinds of terms. And this shows mixing of different races in late colonial Mexico. These were mostly done in Mexico. This was a really famous painter, Miguel Cabrera, who also was painting very high level commissions and had attained very high social standing. De Español y Mestiza Castiza, so somebody who's a mestizo, half Indian, half European, marrying a Castilian, produces a castiza. And let me give you a few more by Cabrera, and let's see what the de mestizo y de India coyote. For an Indian married to a mestizo produces a coyote. So you can start to see kind of a obsession about racial taxonomy in this society. And so what does this mean? Okay, I'm going to just make 3 points very quickly. We'll start with religion. There is caste-like thinking that we can identify as Wilkersonian in Iberian society that carries into the New World. One classic example is the situation with former Jews in the Iberian Peninsula who had either been forcibly converted or converted voluntarily in the late Middle Ages and had emerged into these new centralizing monarchies as citizens or subjects perpetually under suspicion. So this was a product of racialized thinking, and it was a product of policy as well too, which especially enforced by the Inquisition, which began to believe that because of people's inherent bloodlines, that they were predisposed to committing heresy. So this is a classic early racialized thinking. These people also moved to Brazil, people who were New Christians in the Portuguese formation, or Moranos in the Spanish formation. They moved to the Americas. In some cases, the Inquisition followed them. In some cases, it didn't. There was suspicion about them because they had ancestors who had been Jews. And in many cases, they were able to nevertheless compete socially and erase that legacy. And it simply was that if they got wealthy enough, they were usually able to find somebody to write an alternative genealogy for them, or that people were willing to overlook it. So it was a problem. There was a lot of people following them, and they were persecuted on a regular basis. But there were also those who could compete in marketplaces of honor and buy their way to the highest levels of society. So it was actually kind of a mixed outcome in terms of whether it worked or not. So again, the ideas there, the reality was a little bit mixed. And I wanted to bring up these two painters that I mentioned, very high achieving. One was half African and one was half Indian. And I discovered a lot about these things by going to the Met exhibit a few years ago, painted in Mexico. But this showed also potential for mobility. And then just bring up this idea of the Caste paintings in general. This paints a portrait of a society which is obsessed by degrees of race. But actually, what it really witnesses is the inability in the late colonial period of anybody to be able to tell anymore. The Spanish colonial world had produced such a gigantic group of people of mixed race that nobody knew anymore. It was such a thorny problem that basically after independence in the Spanish colonial world, all of these groups of people, whether they were part African, Indian, European, or mixtures, were accepted as citizens in new republics, and slavery disappeared. So it's a very different outcome. The idea is there, but in practice, there are just too many other variables that affect the outcomes here. So it's a good counterpoint to what happened in the United States, where things stayed very, very tight. So, and you have in Mexico, you have full-blooded Indian people being protectors, great politicians, and upholding the republic at various times in history. So, yes, does race disappear? No. Probably the bigger struggles, so much more I could say, the bigger struggle for indigenous people in the post-colonial period is when capitalist economic relationships enter into their villages. That's when they really get almost more pressure than they had in the entire colonial period, when land is privatized in their villages. So there's more. Caste works on many levels, but there are a lot more issues to consider. Is that 10 minutes? Okay.
Wonderful.
Well, great, thank you. So Professor Carp is up next, and in the fall he's teaching Revolutionary Generation and a colloquium in political history.
That's Women in Early America is the short title of that course. So,
Cool, awesome, thank you.
All right. Well, so basically what I want to start out by saying is that if you weren't present at part one of this conversation among the Brooklyn College history faculty, I thought all of the presentations were really brilliant. I know a couple of those presenters are here, but as far as the early US history stuff that I'm going to speak about today, Professor Sengupta gives just a really almost perfect short summary. It's like watching LeBron James do a layup. Like if you want to log off of Zoom and just go watch that again, I won't even be mad. It's really good. And one of the big takeaways that she made is that while the book is politically quite useful, and she sees the political utility of it, as a work of American history, there are some flaws in it that we might want to probe a little bit more deeply. And so if we're thinking about how do we combat the problem of how do we combat structural racism in our own time, right? It can be a very useful book, but if we really want to kind of understand the nuances and complexities of what actually led us to this point, we would want to keep reading, I guess, after this book. And it's always hard to know, right? Like, is Isabel Wilkerson's Caste the first book that you're reading about these problems? Well, okay, like it's going to get you thinking. If it's the 20th book, then you might be like, well, I feel like I saw that explained in a different way elsewhere. And, that's fine. So let's start out with the politics. I'm going to oversimplify, but if you want to get rid of racism in this country, right, you've got a few choices. You can do moral suasion, right? Like write op-eds, give speeches, tell everybody how evil it is, and look at all the awful ways that it's perpetrated. If you have a sufficient basis of power, you can use the halls of government, right? Frederick Douglass is talking to politicians in the 19th century saying, hey, this is a problem. What do we do? And in the 20th century, 21st century, obviously, there are tons more examples. There's radical nonviolent action, boycotts, marches, peaceful protest, labor strikes, work stoppages, etc. And then, if all that fails, right, you have the fire next time, as James Baldwin says, you have violence to really get rid of a system that is doing violence to people of color. And so white and Black people have used all of these different tactics one way or another and disagreed about which tactic was the best one to pursue at pretty much every period of US history, right? And so like already we see that even making use of a book like this for politics is tricky because, people are just going to have different views about what the best approach is to solve these massive and sometimes seemingly intractable problems. And then meanwhile, right, I've seen criticism of this book by scholars from a variety of disciplines saying that the book isn't global enough, it's too rigid, it's not taking certain kinds of nuances into account, it's too pessimistic, it doesn't deal very well with class, it doesn't deal very well with indigenous peoples, right? There's a lot of things that we could say about the book and talk about further. I'm just going to focus on the American history aspects of the book. Now, look, if you've never read any accounts of lynchings during Jim Crow, or you didn't have sufficient appreciations of the microaggression that Black professionals experience in their everyday lives, this book is supremely valuable, right? But the book also can't cover everything, and that's no shade against Wilkinson. But to me, one of the things that's glaringly missing from the book is the entire 18th century. I actually did a search and said, are there any dates beginning with 17? And the answer is really no. And Professor Sengupta compensated for this to a certain degree. She talks a little bit about, the British participation in the Asiento at the beginning of the 18th century, and she gets a little bit into how things begin to change. She talks about Ed Rugemer's book and then how things begin to change in the early Republic. But there's still a massive, very important period in the history of the Black experience in North America that's missing from there, right? Slave importations really get going in the 18th century, in spite of the fact that we think it begins with the 1619 Project, which isn't even accurate because, of course, the 1619 Project is following along, massive slave importations to other parts of the New World as well for a century or more. Parts of the American colonies were deeply invested in the slave trade and in systems of Black enslavement. Some of them become part of the United States, others remain in the British West Indies. So there's a larger story to be told there. And you could argue just endlessly about whether the revolution entrenches systems of slavery and, let's say, racial caste, for another 77 years, as Lincoln says, but, or not. But whatever you decide, right, it's also true that the language of revolution dovetails with, at the time in the late 18th century, pretty minuscule efforts to abolish but very real efforts to abolish the slave trade and even think about doing away with slavery itself. There were Quaker, evangelical, and Black activists who were definitely urging people in that direction, you know, and then it's going to get really organized in Great Britain in the 1790s in particular, you know, and in the United States, it's going to take quite a bit longer, but it's still there. And that aspects of that language, right? And some of that language doesn't even have anything to do with slavery. Some of it is just natural rights language, right? Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. You can argue that Jefferson is both a horrible racist and also a kind of an anti-slavery thinker in some ways, right? He's complicated. And so these ideas of human liberation and equality hover like a kind of sleeper cell in American life, and perhaps even global life after the Age of Revolutions, waiting to kind of destroy the system of slavery and waiting to inspire further fights for greater equality down the road. Now, maybe that's an optimistic take, but it is a take that's kind of missing from Wilkerson's book that I think belongs in a conversation about that book. Now, this leads you to ask a bunch of different questions. Were the conditions of the enslaved substantially different in different parts of the New World, right? Is it the same thing being an enslaved person in the Caribbean versus the South Carolina Low Country versus the Chesapeake versus the Northeast? Why did the first draft of the Declaration of Independence criticize the British monarchs for their role in the slave trade? What's that about? Why is the Constitution too embarrassed to mention slavery explicitly by name, even though it has all these effects on slavery going forward? Why didn't it entrench the notion of property in man when it had the chance? Right? Why did Northerners fight to destroy the slaveocracy? Hundreds of thousands of them are going to die in order to defeat the South. What did slavery look like at the margins, given that you have free Black people, multiracial people, right? We were speaking about the term mulatto. One book that I'd urge you to read in conjunction with Isabel Wilkerson, this is my latest purchase, is a book by A.B. Wilkinson that I just bought called Blurring the Lines of Race and Freedom, Mulattoes and Mixed Bloods in English Colonial America. So just like, okay, right? Like this concept of blurred lines means that there's, you know, actually quite a bit more thinking that we have to do. You know, tens of thousands of Black people fled slavery to take up arms for the British Army during the American Revolution, but then 5,000 of them fought for the rebel army, mostly from New England states in the North. There's just a lot going on here that we need to try and wrap our minds around. And so I think there's a bit of a danger in reading backwards from Jim Crow or the antebellum US in order to figure out what's going on in the 18th century and before. And in fact, you know, maybe Professor Remy's going to speak to this, and I think Professor Ebert just alluded to it. Maybe modernity and capitalism were really the problem and lead to this stuff becoming more entrenched, whereas what you have in the 18th century is fuzzy, and it's fuzzy for a few different reasons. For one thing, the sources are better for the 19th and 20th century, right? So you know explicitly what's going on, and you have more sources from Black people themselves, like talking about their lives and their struggles. And also the codes that govern slavery and race become more rigid and calcified over time. And so in the 18th century, of course, there's racism, right? But then there's also, I think, this sense of contingency and possibility that I'm not willing to throw out just because of the totalizing idea of caste that's potentially being proposed here. I mean, racism is a poison, but it's a very liquid sort of poison, which means that it's fluid enough to fit into different sized bottles. And so it's going to look like one thing in the medieval period, then another thing in the 16th century, then another thing in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and then 20th and 21st centuries, right? Just as racism adapts, anti-racist activism also has to adapt to respond to it. And whether we should have that fight with caste as our principal understanding or not is something that I can't really answer, but I do think that that this book, while valuable in some ways, is also maybe missing some parts of the story that we might want to also make sure we take on board. So that's my 10 minutes.
Awesome, thank you so much. We're going to turn now to Professor Remy. who's teaching a section of Shaping of the Modern World and History 2001 in the fall. Professor Remy.
Thank you, Professor Mancia, and to my colleagues, and thank you all for attending. These are tough acts to follow. I'll do my best. I want to first put in a plug. I got my copy of Caste at a new cafe and independent bookstore in my neighborhood. I live in Lefferts Gardens in Brooklyn. It's Cups and Books on Bedford Avenue, and it's a Black-owned and operated business. There's excellent coffee and pastries, and there's a nice selection of books for adults and children, emphasizing writing by and about people of color. So it's worth a trip if you've never been to Lefferts Gardens anyway. It's a beautiful neighborhood. But if you are there or around, please go to see John in Cups and Books and tell everyone about it. Okay, so one quick caveat, I'm going to use Nazi terminology in this talk. And if this were in print, I'd be using quotation marks. I'm not going to wave my fingers around all the time. I find that incredibly distracting. Also, you'll see that I'm critical of some aspects of Wilkerson's book, but I, for one, very much welcome interlopers. And that points to one of the larger points I want to make about the legacies of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. So in Caste, Wilkerson looks to India's experience and also to that of Germany under the Nazi regime, both comparatively and for direct linkages to better understand the ongoing experience in the US with segregation, discrimination, and violence. Now, for a long time, historians of modern Germany resisted doing something similar, and they were, and to some extent we still are, incredibly provincial. To be sure, when it came to tracing the roots of Nazi racism and anti-Semitism, they looked beyond Germany's borders, but not very far. On the whole, they considered the Nazi phenomenon to be particularly German. Now, the result of this approach didn't only provincialize modern Germany's history, but it reinforced a pernicious conceit that Germany's experience and how we should remember that experience after World War II was not just exceptional, but so exceptional as to exist on some level that resists broader contextualization and comparison. This is particularly true when it comes to the Holocaust. To this day, resistance to comparing and contextualizing the Holocaust remains very powerful, less so among historians and more so among those with a vested interest in maintaining a memory culture of the Holocaust that is exclusionary. Now, I don't want to come across as conspiratorial or critical of efforts to commemorate the Holocaust, but let me give you a specific example of what I'm talking about. In June 2019, US Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez likened detention centers for migrants in the southern United States to concentration camps. And in response, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum issued a statement that said that the museum, and here I'm quoting, unequivocally rejects the efforts to create analogies between the Holocaust and other events, whether historical or contemporary. Now, fortunately, hundreds of scholars in my field responded in an open letter published in the New York Review of Books that categorically rejected the statement as fundamentally ahistorical. But the fact that an institution with the stature and influence like USHMM made this in the first place, I think indicates the enduring strength of this exclusionary account of the genocide. Now, as a historian of modern Germany with an interest in colonial wars, one of the things that was striking about Ocasio-Cortez's statement was that, intentionally or not, it reflected recent research on the global history of concentration camps. In my view, this is a very welcome trend, which arrived on the heels of another promising development. About 20 years ago, a small number of historians set out to situate the Nazi empire and genocide within the broader context of modern imperialism and colonialism. Now, I think it's very important to stress that this was not an original approach. As early as the 1930s, scholars and activists in the Black Atlantic tradition, W.E.B. Du Bois, Ralph Bunche, the Martinican poet Aimé Césaire, they all saw something depressingly familiar in Nazi Germany. White Europeans doing to other white Europeans what they had been doing to non-white peoples around the world for the previous 3 centuries. The fact that these thinkers rarely, to this day, really rarely receive recognition for pioneering an interpretation of the regime that is now widely accepted by historians, I think reflects this deeply entrenched belief that the Nazis represented a form of evil that defies historical comparison. Now, more recently, there's been some important work done on the global influences of Nazi racism and imperial practices, and some of this work has drawn Isabel Wilkerson's attention. The segregated United States was one of several important sources of inspiration for Nazi ideology and some of its race-based laws and policies, particularly how Jews would be defined in legal terms, okay? She also stresses the influence of prominent American white supremacists like Lothrop Stoddard, Madison Grant. Their views, as some of you may know, on the supposed looming replacement of whites by non-whites were recently summarized very succinctly by a contemporary and very influential white supremacist, and that's the Fox News commentator Tucker Carlson. Wilkerson also mentions the significance of what you might call fantasies of empire, right? Hitler was entranced by a fantasy of the American West, which he really knew nothing about. But an American West conquered by heroic white settlers who were unapologetically, that's important, slaying millions of native peoples as they built what would become one of the world's most powerful nations. Now, one of Wilkerson's critics, the American historian Hazel Carby, sees Wilkerson as engaging in a form of provincialism in a way that struck me as similar in some ways to the provincialism in much of the historiography of modern Germany. And Hazel Carby points out that if you broaden your geographic lens from the United States of America to the Americas, and then broaden it even further to include South Asia, you see that caste is this incredibly complicated phenomenon, as Professor Ebert was giving us insight to. In the parts of her book dealing with Nazi Germany, Wilkerson focuses exclusively on a binary, so Jews and non-Jews, and only in Germany. But as with the histories of caste in the Iberian empires and in South Asia, the Nazi racial imperium was not at all binary. And this was true even when it came to defining who was Jewish and who was not Jewish. For Nazi officials, this turns out to be incredibly complicated. And they got no help from academic race scientists because they couldn't agree on a definition of race. So they argue for months and months amongst themselves, and some looked to the segregated United States as a model. And one of the reasons the matter was so complicated for Nazi officials was because of an issue that Wilkerson avoids delving into, and that's the issue of so-called mixed race Germans, known as Mischlinge, a particularly ugly German word. The vast majority of German Jews in 1933 were thoroughly assimilated, and intermarriage and conversions have become increasingly common. And many mixed marriages and conversions took place among middle and even some upper class Germans, and this is a constituency the regime could not afford to alienate. And so this was a reality acknowledged by the relatively more moderate Nazi officials when what would become the Nuremberg race laws were formulated in the mid-1930s. But here's the really important thing for me. The Nazi racial state, so-called, it reached across multiple populations, all right? So the handicapped were the targets of the Nazis' first genocide. The regime also targeted a broad category of Germans it labeled asocials, habitual criminals, so-called, again, many homeless Germans, so the so-called work shy. Another major target was same-sex oriented men, and the SS in particular was deeply and violently homophobic. And same-sex relationships between men had been outlawed since the founding of the German state in 1871. They remained outlawed in the Weimar Republic. Okay, and Germany was hardly alone in criminalizing homosexuality. What did make the Nazi regime distinctive was the incarceration of thousands of homosexual men in concentration camps. They are not targeted for systematic extermination, but they are subjected to extreme brutality. They have a relatively high mortality rate in the camps. Many are also forced to undergo castration as both a form of punishment, but also as a cure, again, in quotes. In some cases, they're subjected to medical experiments. Slavic peoples and Romani, Laleri, and Sinti peoples, also known collectively as gypsies, were all targeted by the regime as subhuman. For these populations, the Nazis' intentions and policies and practices were in both imperial and genocidal. And I think it's also important to remember that the Nazis distinguished among whites. So when Hitler and the SS conceived of a Germanic empire, that included Danes, Swedes, Norwegians, Northern Belgians, or Flemish-speaking Belgians, the Swiss, and some people from the Baltic states. But even then, there were important distinctions to be made, and I'll wrap this up. For example, Hitler and the SS considered Norwegians to be of exceptionally high racial stock, that is higher even than the Germans. So in this case, Nazi race policy plays out in the bodies of Norwegian women who were recruited by the SS to bear children for placement with families in Germany. One other example, the SS was willing to allow a very small number of ethnic Poles to be Germanized, so-called, depending on their appearance. So I mean, there's a kind of arbitrariness in this mad theater of cruelty that can be very difficult to get your mind around. So in the end, I agree with Hazel Carby that in general, understanding how systems of racial, ethnic, gendered, and sexual classifications shape the modern world. If we want to understand this, we can't be confined to binaries like black, white, or non-Jewish, Jewish, and nor I think can we be confined to the borders of modern nation states. I hope that didn't go over. I did a little bit. I'm sorry. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So I think we're going to open the floor up. And if people have questions or comments, if the presenters have connections that they want to make, if presenters from the first Caste panel want to jump in, whatever, it's an open floor. So connections between things you've learned in class, opinions of the book. Kinga.
So thank you, the fascinating presentations on all fronts. I have a question maybe to everyone, but Professor Meyer, you've mentioned the kind of portrayal of African-American in the culture and in the pop culture, in movies. And do we see whether today or across in the history, portrayal of other groups, whether it's the Uyghurs today in China or Jews in Nazi Germany, and how are they portrayed in a popular culture? How was that used to kind of to perpetuate the system in a way?
Is that a question for me or just
maybe for you first, and then if anyone has anything to say, I'm happy to listen.
You know, part of what I was saying, the very end of what my comments was, you know, one of the things that struck me about Wilkerson's book is that when I think about Chinese social history, certainly there are examples of really brutal subordination and oppression of different groups. And what's going on with the Uyghurs today is a particularly heinous one. But there aren't many examples of what Wilkerson is describing, this kind of perfect storm, this integration of lots of different forms of economic and cultural and sort of quasi-biological control and oppression being applied to specific groups in Chinese society. You know, right, I think if you were to do a survey of Chinese culture in recent years, and you looked at the way Uyghurs were being depicted in different forms of media, and compared that to the way African Americans have been portrayed in American pop culture, you'd see parallels. And certainly, I mean, I'll defer to Professor Remy on this. You'd see parallels between cultural depictions of African Americans, especially if you went back to contemporary, right? If you look at films of the 1930s and the way they're depicting African Americans here in the United States, and the way Jews are being depicted in various forms of media in Nazi Germany, you would see some really starkly horrifying parallels, right? And again, you know, I don't know enough about the history of Indian popular culture to comment on that. Perhaps Professor Banerjee knows more, but I would suspect that if you did a deep dive into different forms of Indian literature and art, that the case of the Harijan would also yield parallels, right?
And Kinga, just let me be clear, your question about popular culture, you cut out for a second when you were asking the questions, so I wasn't.
Yes, I was kind of asking about the popular culture and how the popular culture perhaps is used to portray specific groups in a specific way. So yes.
Okay.
I mean, one of the, you know, it's interesting to look at the history of blackface, right? So like ever since the early 90s with Eric Lott's Love and Theft, right? Thinking about blackface performance has been, you know, a kind of really interesting way to kind of collect a lot of thinking about, you know, portrayals in popular culture and how they, you know, and how they represent this kind of major wedge of the kind of thing that that Wilkerson is talking about. And so, you know, these performances first begin like surprisingly early on in the 19th century, and they represent this way of kind of just crowding out more authentic or, you know, Black artistic portrayals. And so, you know, and it's one of the reasons why you see this kind of urgency to stamp out the remaining traces of it, because it really endures. And like, I mean, and it influenced Walt Disney. Like there are some pretty insidious ways in which like, you know, blackface kind of like even still gets to our children nowadays. I mean, it's such a major part of stage performance and then vaudeville and then early film that it's that it really seems so persistent and intransigent in some ways that like when you think about it long enough, you're like, well, all right, Isabel Wilkerson actually has a pretty good point about how pervasive and difficult to dislodge you know, this stuff is. But you know, I mean, and this is why the people who argue for representation say representation matters. As you get more people of color as decision makers in Hollywood, in, you know, in New York theater, you know, et cetera, like you have the people in the room who are like, hold on, that's actually horrible. Like, don't, you know, you know, and so we start to get, you know, much cooler stuff. We've been watching this cartoon every week that's on Netflix called Kipo and the Age of Wonder Beasts with my 7-year-olds. And it's just like, it's awesome. And it's like, it's just really good on LGBT representation, racial representation, stuff like that. It's a kids program, but it just shows what a difference there is between the kind of children's stuff that's accessible today and then what would have been accessible to me as a kid, you know, X number of years ago.
Taylor.
Hi. I wasn't able to read the book, or I actually never even heard of it till this discussion right now, but just to continue talking on the topic that we're on about like the media portrayal of like Black people and other cultures, like, and when Carp said about for Disney, and I was just remembered of like Fantasia, in the moment where I think it's like a baby and she has like these big buck teeth and like bows in her hair, and just like the way that the character is portrayed and how different it is in modern than it was just a few decades ago, of the difference in the portrayal of Black people in the media, of how now it's they made it more subtle, so as if like you can't pick up on it as much as you could have, you know, we're not seeing people walk around in blackface anymore in movies. But instead now we have those characters that would have been in blackface actually being portrayed by actual Black people, like being robbers, murderers, thieves, and everything like that. And like how Professor Meyer was saying when his another student that he was with in Asia, when she said like she never has met Black people before, and how these portrayals and how it just keeps getting more subtle, and how it's just easier for people to continue to perpetuate like these ideas of a certain type of culture and group in society. So I just find it like really interesting of like the sort of, trying to think of the right word, just of how the transgression has like occurred from the early 20th century in movies to now.
Yeah, I mean, part of the solution is you just have to start to, mock this stuff and make it as embarrassing as possible, because this idea of kind of like kidding about this stuff and being really subtle is kind of a tactic that the fascists use in the United States nowadays, right? To be like, oh, I was only joking. You can't take that seriously. But like, then they put these kind of ugly ideas out there. And so on the internet, that can be kind of, it's like a game, right? To kind of like be as offensive as possible, but then have kind of deniability about it. And so you really do have to be very vigilant to kind of make sure, like I was with my fluidity metaphor before, you got to make sure this doesn't like flow into a new bottle and take a new form, and try and establish your beachheads of representation so that there's, I guess, enough of a multiracial coalition to combat this stuff within the centers of power that make our culture, and and other realms of life too. We don't only have to talk about pop culture, even though it's fun.
I wonder, before we get to Professor Troyansky, Salima, I don't want to put you on the spot, but in some ways your master's thesis is kind of about this in a way. I wondered if you have any insights, feel free to contribute them, but no pressure. If you want a minute to think, you can have a minute to think. But I just want to show you off.
I'll take a minute to think.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Professor Troyansky.
Okay, I can't wait to hear what Salima has to say, because I'm teaching her this semester. Don't cover your face. Okay. I want to pick up on a couple of things that have been said about popular culture, but also about cross-cultural imaginings. And so when I teach French history, one of the things I sometimes play with is French views of America, American views of France, but particularly French views of African Americans and African American culture. And there's a way in which there's been a tradition, kind of like what Andy Meyer described in China, of emphasizing American racism and using it as a stick to beat the United States. And to some extent, that's gone on historically in France. They will ignore the French involvement in the slave trade. They'll ignore the Code Noir. They'll ignore all kinds of things. But it's a way of saying, look, there's that racism in the United States, and we have none of that. And it's been interesting to see how, first of all, there's a very real influence of African American culture on France, whether in terms of music or literature or film. But also there's been a significant trend in French historiography, often driven by American historians, including African American historians of France, to demonstrate, you can't be that self-righteous because we see this racist sort of tradition within France as well. And it ends up being something that is at the center of contemporary political debate about whether to count people of different races or religions, something the French government actually made illegal, and how France should deal with multiculturalism. So multiculturalism becomes a sort of stick by which certainly the right, but also now Macron in the center, will use politically. But it's interesting how these notions of race and racial difference end up being utilized in different international contexts for all kinds of reasons. And there are some ways in which maybe Wilkerson gets at that in other ways in which it's not really what she's talking about. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Go ahead, Professor Remy.
I'm just well, Salima, I don't want to jump in if you wanted to say a few things about your work, or I don't want to put you on the spot either. So.
I mean, I'm not sure exactly what, did you want me to describe it, or I don't?
I mean, I don't, so Kinga asked this question about popular culture, right?
Oh, yeah.
In some ways, your thesis is bringing together history and kind of popular culture in a way, right? If a sort of museum or Colonial Williamsburg is sort of part of popularization of history, or anyway, I was just wondering if you could even just tell us what the topic of your thesis is. And yeah.
I mean, my thesis is just looking at the ways history writing like has influenced public or academic writing has influenced public history institutions. And I think just from what I've been learning about my thesis, it's not only necessarily like popular culture that kind of perpetuates these racist ideas. Some of them stem from, you know, very old historical research. And that's what's actually perpetuated in the public. So it's not always, I guess, like the circulation of these ideas, it's not always just from people who don't know any better. A lot of the times it's people who do know better, and they are presenting these ideas alongside other credible research.
Totally. Right on, man. Right on. So this torture that we put you all through, right, when we study historiography, the history of how things are written, and the sort of like academic, like a divestment of our own accountability, right? We know everything, you know, everyone knows, you know, that we know the things. Salima is just sort of taking us to task for that. I think it's awesome. Professor Remy, what did you want to say?
Well, I was just ruminating on popular culture, and I think one general comment to make about the Nazis, well, first is contextual, right? I mean, when the regime comes to power, it almost immediately really takes control of the press, the media, and including artistic production, visual arts and performing arts. In a way, in a really, really totalizing kind of way. So there's strict control of what's produced, but there's an ideological dimension to this too. I mean, Hitler, the simplest way to put it is that Hitler and other regime ideologues believed that if human beings could be degenerate, so-called, so could the art that they produced. Of course, here there's art that is particularly modern art, but it could be any visual representation. Hitler despised modern art, and he imposed his aesthetic on everybody. Mussolini, by comparison, he didn't care about art. So modernist currents of the arts actually continue to exist in fascist Italy, not in Germany. But if you were Jewish, it didn't matter what it was that you produced. But there was also considerable fear among the Nazis of art that they associated with Black Americans, and the most prominent example here is jazz music. Jazz is not exclusively African American. But this is the association that the Nazis made. I won't repeat the language that they used. You can imagine what it was to describe it. But they borrow the N-word from English and incorporate it into German as both a noun and a verb. To describe artwork that, jazz music as degenerate music, or visual art that they consider to be degenerate because they associate it for some reason with with blackness, even if the artist was not, and himself, they're overwhelmingly male artists who were targeted by the regime, was not black. So, and I could say probably a few things about film too, but I'll leave it at that. With the last thing I'll say though is the influence that the impact it had on public opinion though, on public perceptions, that's harder to say. It's anytime you study anything like this, it's much easier to study the output than it is to the actual impact on public perceptions.
I wonder, I mean, Professor Ebert, in some ways I see your presentation as a kind of outlier in terms of the rigidity, right? In which, I mean, Professor Carp also was talking about the sort of fluidity and the mixedness of a lot of these perceptions. But I'm thinking of, a lot of talk about early sort of inventions or ideas about race when we're thinking about sort of the medieval period, often talks about race as something that's being constructed by the people in power who are anxious to maintain their power, right? And so if Christians in Spain are legislating against the interaction between Jews and Christians or Muslims and Christians, they're doing it not because they want to define that's a Jew, that's a Muslim, but rather because they want to define those are not Christians, we are Christians, to be Christian means X. And I wonder if that kind of thing is also going on in the sort of Iberian colonial world or the world that you're studying, where all of these sort of Castas paintings and stuff like that are about defining the dominant culture, the colonial culture, the culture that's trying to exert its hegemony. I mean, that's what the Nazis are doing too, obviously, but I'm just interested in what you think about that it's not as much about the other as it is about the constructor.
Probably. And the Castas paintings are something that appear mostly in New Spain, really at the end of the colonial period. And I think they're a reflection, they're a little bit of and they may have been painted mostly for sale to visitors as well too. I don't know how much they represent, but they may point to an ability to try to impose some order on a situation which was impossible to measure or control anymore. But I don't see these kinds of meaningful productions in early encounters. And they had to figure it out as they went along. At the point that the Iberians were colonizing, they had imposed a universal Christianity on their kingdoms at home. And there was quite a lot of uncertainty about how to proceed in Africa with the Portuguese, and in the Americas, what was lawful enslavement, what was a lawful war. There was recognition very early on, I think, by most people that other people in the Americas had souls and were fully human. I don't think there was a seriously entertained proposition that wasn't the case. And Iberians were not necessarily always in a strong position. Consequently, up and coming conquistadores, so-called conquistadores, were usually very well prepared, whether on the coast of Africa or in India or in the Americas, to cement their uncertain position by marrying into elite families of whatever group was dominant in these areas. It's very typically done. So that says something as well too. So I don't know if I answered your question. I wouldn't want to put too much weight on the Castas paintings. What I thought was interesting about a lot of these representations is the fact that these are the works of really socially mobile mixed race people. I mean, that's an interesting angle just right there.
Professor Banerjee.
Now, I want to chime in to what Professor Ebert is saying, because and we saw it. Ben said that, Professor Carp said that, Professor Remy mentioned. that caste was constantly, it's a very fluid and a very, very complex idea. And I would emphasize, Professor Troyansky's use of the word imaginings, and that imagination has been produced and reproduced and created and recreated through various taxonomies. I would use the word because sometimes, Professor Ebert showed art. When I presented on it, I talked about textual production that the British were engaged in, how through ethnography and anthropomorphic divisions, caste was, it's not that it was not there, but it was also reproduced in various ways. So, but at the end, I want to come back to what Professor Meyer has indicated, that it is a very, very useful text in the present context. Although, we would imagine that we know a lot about particularly specialists. We do know the implications of caste. In the Indian context, the word caste came from the Portuguese, from the Iberian word casta. Prior to that, it had a very different word, but indigenous word is also very different. But nonetheless, this book is very helpful to think with and to show the swath of parallel experiences where how rankings, differences, discriminations based on gender, race, and many other variables we can include as many, religion, were created across societies through a very long period of time. So that's my two.
I kind of want to ask an unanswerable question in response to that, which is that if the book is arguing that caste is intractable, right, it doesn't really give us much of a platform for doing anything about it. And so I guess I just wonder that about Afro-pessimism in general, is like, what's the path forward if you really think that this stuff can't be done away with? Like that's what I always wonder, is what's the prescriptive next step? And maybe that's not the scholar's job to figure that out. It's just to kind of say what they see and say, all right, now do something about it,
Well, I think she's a journalist, and she's basically feeding popular minds. She doesn't have that onus of supplying us with an answer of how to deal with it. But I wish she had done that. But just to raise, even those popular stories like Emmettle and all that most of us know about. Again,
I think if I understand, what, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Swapna, but, I don't know that Wilkerson is necessarily saying that nothing can be done about it. What I understood the argument she was making was, look, this phenomenon is so complicated that it's going to require solutions on many different fronts, right? It's going to require cultural and political and economic and social interventions, very robust interventions sustained over long periods of time to dismantle. I mean, in some respects, if you had just made that argument 10 years ago, a lot of academics would be like, oh yeah, what I think is useful about the book is that she really provides all of these very evocative illustrations of why that's true, right? Yeah, that's what impressed me about the book.
Steve.
To follow up on the point Professor Carp was making, and look, I have the same questions about Afro-pessimist tradition, and being in many ways a pessimist myself about a lot of things. There's a part of it that sort of speaks to me. But I will say, one thing Wilkerson talks a little bit about, not very much, but she does talk about a little bit about historical reckoning. And if any, I can recommend also a really interesting conversation she has on the Politics and Prose bookstore website. You can see it on YouTube with the lawyer Brian Stevenson. Some of that name might be familiar to some of you, but they talk about the necessity of of a really honest, however painful, reckoning with the past. And Ta-Nehisi Coates has also written about this as well in The Case for Reparations. And now that the House of Representatives is actually now going to actually discuss this, I think is more than symbolic. I think it's very important. And as a historian, I'm convinced, and I want to very much believe that this is part of the way out. And it was, however long it took, however incomplete and problematic it was, I think a case can be made that it worked pretty well in post-war Germany. And I can recommend everybody Susan Neiman's book, Learning from the Germans. Susan Neiman, a woman who grew up Jewish in the South during the Civil Rights era and a Civil Rights active family, and is now living in Berlin as head of the prestigious Einstein Forum, has written a really interesting book about this, what Americans can learn from the Germans.
Cool. Kinga.
I just wanted to kind of, I think Professor Meyer touched on what I wanted to say. And I also wanted to say that I think from African-American experience, I think it's easier to see how it might be perceived as the caste system is kind of intractable because it continually reinvents itself. And we've seen that throughout the history. So I kind of can sympathize with being a bit of a pessimist in seeing a way out of it. And because, you know, we've seen the system continually adapt and continually invent itself. And, you know, I have a lot to learn, but I'm curious to also see, I don't know, again, in Nazi Germany, it seems that it's very much, that was more ideologically driven, versus here in the United States, really the role of capitalism and the financial incentives in, again, as well, perpetuating the caste system, and how that plays, and even till today. So I would just wanted to say I could sympathize with being a pessimist in this case.
Cool. Thank you, Kinga. Any other comments or questions? I want to leave you just with I was at on Zoom children's book panel yesterday, and the son of Walter Dean Myers, whose name is Christopher Myers and is himself an award-winning children's book artist and just artist in general, told us about how when he was little, and this speaks to Kinga's earlier point, when he was little, his dad let him watch as much TV as he wanted, as long as the sound was off and he could take notes on categories of people that he was watching and what they were doing. So like all of the Asian women were doing this. This is the story that the TV was telling without words, just with body language, right? And what's amazing is that he's become an artist who's really interested in advocating for lots of different diverse perspectives through his visual art, right? But I think that it's a fabulous exercise. I want to be doing it with my 5-year-old like tomorrow, right? But also just to sort of speak to Kinga's point, to Professor Meyer's point, right? That like we tell so much about these systems, about these taxonomies beyond words, right? Just with the gestures and the body language and all of that stuff. And so that's a sort of plug to use those kinds of sources when we're doing history too. That we can look at the Caste's paintings, we can look at the popular culture from India, etc. Actions speak louder than words or whatnot. But thank you all for coming. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you. I'm so glad Taylor's going to read the book now. If you want to learn more or hear more, in the chat is part 1 of this conversation. And I hope we see you all next week at the alumni panel on Wednesday at 7 p.m. Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
I have a question.
Yes.
I wasn't here for the first panel, so I wanted to know